Yes, ma'am. Sujata, ma'am,
Uh,
just give stop presenting. You are presenting your screen.
Hi everyone. Good morning. Once again, you are looking at my face. I think after 4 days, and nice to meet you all. And regarding my feedback, I would like to thank Dr. Maidili for having given me this great opportunity. And to be frank, I have never done any online presentation so far. It was a tough task for me, even after putting in so many years of experience in teaching. We are always used to look at the audience in front of us, and we teachers are very good at judging how they are listening to us or not listening, or anything can be like judged. But this is totally a new platform, and I never ventured this because I didn't have any kind of faith in this, because if you can't see anybody in front of you, it's like speaking to the air. So, like speaking to a ghost, I must say, to be frank. But Dr. Maithili had made it wonderfully, like a different thing. So she was giving me a kind of practice to be frank. She was giving a trial how to speak, and when you open the screen, like very horribly, our face is appearing. That was like really horrible to look at our face and speaking, like speaking to a mirror. So I was totally scared. I have never experienced this in my life. I can just control the whole crowd, audience, the classroom, everything is okay. But looking at our face is very tough. That's how translation is. We always like think it's a very easy or something like that. But when it comes to a kind of practical application, it's very tough. And Dr. Maithili had done it wonderfully. And I thank the college, Vasavi College, for giving this opportunity to her. And she's such a wonderful person with patience, lot of patience, and she has given training to all. She kept on working, and I think many are looking at the minus points of this kind of online seminars, like you're not able to see the viewer, or sometimes you have to mute. All these things we have to keep in control, like how we keep our class in control as the teachers of English language. We have to keep our students in control. When they want to go away and they want to talk something, murmur, I never like such things in my class. If they want to talk, let them talk. If I have to talk, they have to listen to me. It's like maybe it's like it sounds very dictated like, but still this is a very different thing. That's what I want to tell you, and she has succeeded in that, I must say. And regarding this translation workshop, I could have the privilege of listening to great speakers like Maniam sir and Shanti Chitra ma'am and Susila ma'am. Susila ma'am is great. She's a stalwart. I really wanted to meet her once because she belongs to Tamil literature and she's speaking good English. That's a great thing, and so she's a role model to us. And today's speaker also. So it's a great platform. And my dear participants, you might be a lecturer, a professor, or a research scholar, or a student. I just place an humble request that don't leave it as it is. Okay, I have seen many webinars. They simply talk on some subject and they go off. But we have to do something fruitful to our society. So I place a request to Dr. Maithili Madam that if possible, if there is a possibility, because again the burden will be on Maithili Madam, so we can compile a book of assignments, like you can take a short story from your mother tongue and you can try to translate, maybe from Bengali or from Odia or from Kerala or from any other state. You can take a kind of like a small short story of 2 pages. You can try to translate into English, whoever is interested, and we can take that and we can compile it, and we can even publish a book if possible, and that will be a credit to all of us. Whoever is doing it will be a credit to you. This is a suggestion only, because it's very easy nowadays. In those days, in our days, publishing a book was a Herculean task, but now it's possible. So it's going to be a contribution. So this is a suggestion, and with these few words, I wish you all best of luck, and I would like to meet you more often. You can very well try to contact me. My mail ID is there. If anybody needs my PowerPoint, I would like to give you. And I'm really happy to be a part of this 7 days international conference. Thank you, Maithili. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I hope Kadambari ma'am is there on the line. And Sujata Sundar ma'am, you're just presenting your screen to everyone. Could you please give stop presenting from your mobile? I again repeat, Sujata Sundar ma'am, you're presenting your screen to everyone. Just give the option stop presenting in your mobile. Right. So it's time for us to welcome today's guest actually, and I just express my excuse to sir for making him wait for the last 10 minutes. And I would like to give introduction about sir. Actually, when I asked for this biodata to have a short introduction about him, I was amazed seeing his short introduction because it was not short, it was very short, which ran up to 25 pages. So I was amazed with Sachin C. Ketkar sir. He's here, he's a bilingual writer at large, a translator, editor, blogger, researcher based in Baroda, Gujarat. He holds a doctorate from VN South Gujarat University, Surat. He claims 22 years of rich teaching experience, currently working as Professor of English, Faculty of Arts in Maharaja Sajirao University of Baroda. He also coordinates a coordinator of the Department of Research project under UGC SAP DRS2. Indian literatures and cultures with emphasis on Marathi and Gujarati literatures and cultures being his primary area of research. He has translated early century and contemporary poetries from Marathi and Gujarati and also poems from English to Marathi. As a feather added to this cap, Literary Journal Sahitya Academy New Delhi awarded him Indian Literary Poetry Translation Prize in the year 2000. He has published nearly 60 articles, interviews, and book reviews. He has 24 citations, two of them were H index and one in I-10 index. His area of specialization are Marathi literature, comparative literature, Indian literature, translation studies, etc. He has published a novel, several poems, and translated huge number of poems. He is the editor and reviewer of many journals. His academic achievement data runs up to 25 pages, which shows overwhelming interest and his consciousness towards literature and translation. And it is my pleasure to have such an eminent and versatile personality amidst us to deliver his lecture on translation studies and world literature. I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Sachin Ketkar sir, C. Ketkar sir. Sir, the floor is yours. You can take up, sir.
Good morning, all of you. Good morning, Dr. Maithili.
Good morning.
Am I audible? Can you see
Yes,
me?
yes, sir. You're audible, sir.
Yeah. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Maithili for having me in this such important event of translation workshop that you have organized. So I also want to congratulate you for organizing this excellent workshop. And I also want to thank you for that generous introduction. And I'm very happy to be with all of you, with all the distinguished academicians in the South. I have interacted mostly, my area of research has been with Gujarati and Marathi. And it's my pleasure to share whatever I have done, my research with you. So without much ado, I think I will go straight over to my presentation. The topic of my presentation today is from translation studies to world literature. The idea of world literature has been an emergent idea in past couple of decades. And translation studies also seems to have taken great strides after 90s. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explore the common ground between the two important disciplinary formations. And for that, I would like to share my slides with all of you. Yeah. Can you see the slide?
Sir, just a minute, sir. Yes, sir. You are presenting, sir.
Yeah. So thanks, and I would like to begin right away. And what I'm trying to look at is how translation studies can be thought of as world literature, and how world literature can be thought of as translation studies. The objective of this presentation is to develop this argument that the certain conceptual methodological formulations developed by the theorists of world literature after 1990s, like David Damrosch, Pascal Casanova, Franco Moretti, among others, display continuities with the development of in translation studies, especially the very redefinition of idea of translation and methodologies for studying translation. So this is an overarching argument that I'm making, but through this argument, what I want to do is I want to introduce students and researchers to recent development and debates in translation studies and world literature, and also explore common ground and differences between the two disciplines. So there is an overarching argument which I'm trying to make, and inside of this overarching argument, I'm trying to introduce many of researchers who may be at the beginners level in this workshop. There may be very advanced researchers also, but I'm trying to maybe engage with both of them, but primarily I'm trying to introduce the researchers who have started looking into the question of translation and comparative literature. And how do I plan to go about it is in this way. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to begin by talking about two contemporary translations of world literature. I'm going to take two texts. So in spite of the fact that the most of my presentation will be theoretically inclined, I want to ground myself into important solid text so that it will help the audience to grasp the arguments that I'm trying to make. Then I will try to point out how the conventional views of translation, which are pervasive in our country, though not all researchers take that. There are researchers who avoid this kind of conventional views of translation, are inadequate to understand the significance of this translation. From traditional conventional translation studies, I will then go over to what is known as contemporary translation studies, after I point out the inadequacies of conventional translation studies, and then also take a look at traditional views of world literature and to contemporary approaches in world literature that came into forefront after the 90s, and explore the relation between translation and world literature. So that is how my presentation will flow today. So let us begin by taking a look at the first text that I want to look at. The first text is a translation of a very well-known book called Unto This Last by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who needs no introduction, obviously. In 1904, sometime between 8th to 25th June, while traveling from Johannesburg to Durban, Gandhi read a book called Unto This Last, which was written in 1860 by the leading British art critic and thinker, John Ruskin. And what does Gandhi say about this book when he first read it? He says, "I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance to the ideals of this book." In his famous autobiography, in a chapter titled The Magic Book of Spell of a Book, Gandhi says that this was the book that brought about an instantaneous and practical transformation in my life. So people who are aware of Gandhi's biography know how he was treated while traveling to Durban, to Johannesburg, and how he was thrown out of the coach. But what people do not emphasize sufficiently is impact made by certain books on Gandhi. And this is one of the important books that led a lasting impression on Gandhi's mind, and it transformed his life. He summarized the whole book in 3 points. that the good of the individual is contained in the good of all, that a lawyer's work has the same value as the barber's, in as much as all have the same right to earning their livelihood from their work. And the third point that he made was that a life of labor, the life of tiller of the soil and the handicraftsman is the life worth living. Then he went on to summarize the whole book into Gujarati. He translated it very freely and gave it a title called Sarvodaya, that is welfare of all. And it was published in 9 installments in Indian Opinion during May to July 1908, which is almost 112 years ago. Then the book was retranslated back into English. Now this is very interesting, by Walji Govind Desai in 1956, in which Govindji Desai says, Walji Govindji Desai says, Ruskin's words are being retained as far as possible. This circulation of text from English to Gujarati and from Gujarati back into English and its profound impact on freedom struggle through translation reveals translation as the key mechanism of world literature. So this is our first book, and I need not tell you much about Unto This Last, because many of you would be teachers of English and you may have heard of this book. Some of you may also have taught this book, as I did at one point of time. Unto This Last is a very sharp critique of laissez-faire, that is the whole liberal economical thought that says that the free hand of market, that market is a kind of self-regulatory mechanism which should not be governed by the state. So the whole philosophy of liberal capitalist economy that was developed by people like Adam Smith came under sharp critique from John Ruskin. And Ruskin followed something called Christian socialism. So he's using metaphors from the Bible. So the title of his book, Unto This Last, actually is a phrase taken from the Bible, which says that even the last person in the row will get the same wages as the first person who enters the vineyard. So that's a very famous parable in Bible, which John Ruskin is using. Now this whole idea is transformed into Gujarati, and it's called Sarvodaya. And Sarvodaya is welfare of all. So one question that would come to our mind from a very conventional approach to translation studies would be, is Sarvodaya a good translation of Unto This Last? Or is it accurate translation? Or does Gandhi capture the spirit of the original? Or does Gandhi remain faithful to the original? These are some of the questions that we continuously ask in the older paradigm of translation studies. And I'm sure you must have heard of these ideas. You must have, some of you also must have discussed these ideas. But let's take a look at another text. And it comes from the opposite end of political spectrum, ideologically. And the book is written, the book is called 1857 Swatantra Samar by a thinker and a freedom fighter called Vinayak Damodar Savarkar from 1883 to 1966. He wrote a book in Marathi, and it was translated into English as Indian War of Independence in 1857 during his stay in London as a student of law, in which he countered the colonial interpretation of mutiny from a revolutionary nationalist perspective. Interestingly, some years, probably in the same year or so, Savarkar may have met Gandhi in India House, where he used to stay. So Gandhi visited this India House. It was a place made by a very famous Gujarati freedom fighter called Shyamji Krishnavarma. And in this place, they probably have met, but we don't know with clarity whether they actually met and interacted. But Savarkar used to stay in this place, and this is the place where he also formed secret revolutionary societies. When he wrote this book in Marathi, he wanted to publish it from Maharashtra. So secretly he sent this book to Maharashtra, but British Secret Service got a whiff of this, and they raided the press, and this book was actually banned before it even went to the press in Maharashtra. So the book had to be secretly sent back to London, where Savarkar used to live. So there was no way by which he could publish this book in Marathi, which is very interesting. So the whole group of revolutionaries wanted to publish it in Paris because France and Germany were not under British colonial rule. So they wanted to publish it later at Germany, where they thought they would have Devanagari fonts, because Germany had a very flourishing academic orientation towards Orientalism and Indology, as we are aware. And Savarkar and the revolutionaries thought that probably they would publish it from Germany. However, these governments did not want to offend the British. So the Marathi book could not be published. The book was then later translated into English by the members of the revolutionary group called Abhinav Bharat, started by Savarkar. And the people who translated it along with Savarkar were Koregaonkar, Phadke, Kunte, under supervision of Mr. B.V.S. Iyer, another revolutionary who was based there. The English translation was then sent to Holland and published from Holland in 1907. The revolutionaries then spread rumor that book is being printed in France. So the British government stepped in and tried to get it banned, but they realized that it was not being published in France, while it was actually being published in Holland. Revolutionaries then smuggled the book, the translation, into India by wrapping the book in the covers printed with bogus names, such as the posthumous papers of Pickwick Club, Scott's Work, Don Quixote. The later editions of book were secretly brought out by freedom fighters like Madame Bikaji Kama in France, the famous Gadar Party in USA, and also equally famous Rash Bihari Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose published this book in Japan. The book was officially published in India in English and Marathi only after 1947. So you can see that this is very fascinating history of a book that is written in Marathi, but because it cannot be published in Marathi, it had to be translated. And even after being translated, it could not be published in many parts of the world. So it had to be secretly published from Holland, and then it had to be smuggled in various ways. What is fascinating about the story of this translation is that it had immense impact on revolutionary freedom struggle, which put violence as one of their important methods of freedom struggle. So there is another book by Gandhi which puts non-violence at core of its politics, while this is the book which promotes violence. So you can see that there are two ways in which you can resist colonial empire, and both these ways of resisting colonialism, British colonialism, involves translation either from English, like Gandhi did, or into English, like Savarkar and his revolutionary friends did. So you are translating from the language of the colonizers to resist the politics and the colonial oppression, or you're translating it into English, again to resist or to fight colonialism. So what is the point that I'm trying to make by discussing these two translations? The point that I'm trying to make is, if you ask very traditional questions about translation, like, is it a good translation? Did Koregaonkar, Phadke, Kunte did a good work? Did it capture the spirit? Did it capture, was the translation faithful? Was it close enough? Or was it transcreation? All these traditional questions of translation do not address some of the very important things that translation can do. One of the things that translation can do is actually launch a freedom movement like Sarvodaya. And Sarvodaya is a cornerstone of Gandhian politics. And it was translated into all Indian languages. So you can see that translation becomes one of the ways in which movements across the world are generated. So if you ask whether it is good translation, bad translation, whether equivalents are possible, whether Sarvodaya is a good translation of unto this last, then such questions actually do not help us to understand the significance, the importance of this activity. And this importance of this activity is historical role played by this book. Is James 1 translation of the Bible a good translation? For me, is irrelevant question, or even outdated question. Whether it captures the spirit of it is not important. What is important is what is the role of this translated work in the cultural history of that place. And you can see that King James Bible influenced the later development of English literature profoundly. You cannot think of Milton or Shakespeare or even later writers who were deeply influenced by the English language used in this translated text. So the conventional paradigm of translation, and that is what I'm trying to argue, is clearly inadequate because it asks these kind of questions to us. Poetry is what is lost in translation. Translation is like a woman. If she is beautiful, she is not faithful. Or if she is faithful, she is not beautiful. Translation involves loss and it's always approximate. Never translate word for word or never translate literally. Translation should be faithful to the spirit rather than to letter of the original. This conventional thinking about translation is older than the Roman thinkers like Cicero or Horace. Now you can ask these questions to, say for example, if I ask the question, what is lost in Gandhi's rewriting of Sarvodaya? Or what is lost in Koregaokar's translation of Savarkar's book? Or is it faithful? Now all these questions to me sound absolutely useless questions when I sit down to study two seminal books like these. So contemporary translation studies has moved away from this traditional conventional thinking about translation. It has, because it's primarily dualistic, normative and hierarchic. It invariably compares the translation with the original and invariably sees translation as an inferior and secondary to the original. Now, if you see that Savarkar's English translation was inferior to its Marathi, or if you say that Gandhi's Sarvodaya is inferior to Unto This Last, now this is a ridiculous thing to say, because Unto This Last was not considered as important as Sarvodaya is to Indian society and culture. The place that the text occupies in translating culture also changes with translation. Ruskin's book is just one of the books in the history of English literature, while Gandhi's book is one of the leading theoretical, ideological texts in the Gandhian politics of freedom struggle. The traditional views of translation sees translation from the point of view of the source text and a language and is primarily focused on practice of translating. The discipline of translation studies, however, which is different from thinking about translation that we have been discussing, which goes back to times of Cicero and Homer and Horace. This kind of thinking of translation is very old, but the discipline of translation studies only seems to emerge in the late 70s. It was only in 1978 that James Holmes proposed that the name of translation studies be adopted for the discipline that concerns itself with the problems raised by production and descriptions of translation. So towards the end of the 1970s, you find that there is a whole discipline called translation studies emerging. Before that, we looked at translation as a kind of branch of applied linguistics. You may have looked at, you may have thought of Catford, you may have discussed NIDA. Many people have thought about translation largely from applied linguistics perspective, but discipline of translation studies seems to emerge only in 1978 with James Holmes. So how is contemporary translation studies different from the traditional translation studies? the theoretical, and I think translation theory is a very recent development. It's only 20th century development. You may have heard of Walter Benjamin and his remarkable theorization of translation. You may be familiar with the translation theories of Roman Jakobson. I'm sure you must have discussed it in the workshop at some point. With these developments, you see that translation is could be thought of as something that can be theorized. I don't know whether in the course of this workshop, whether you discussed Walter Benjamin's very famous theory of translation as afterlife and his notion of Ur language, where he's arguing that translation is not secondary, but it gives life to the text and it gives afterlife to the text. Benjamin also famously argues that translation is almost a superior activity than original creative writing, and that is because it actually takes the text out from its linguistic constraints and takes it into the universal language of man. And he's referring to the fall of Babel, where the universal essential Ur language of man was destroyed by God's wrath when he scattered all people across the earth after the fall of Babel. I'm sure you must have heard of these stories. So Walter Benjamin argues that translation takes text into a superior domain. So for him, translation is a kind of almost superior activity to original. That's a very powerful argument that he is developing. And you can see that translation starts being theoretical in 20th century. Till then, it was only practice-based. People used to ask questions from practice rather than as a theory. What are the other questions that we ask in contemporary translation studies? What is the role played by translation in literary history and cultural history? For example, the rewriting of Ramayana by Kamban or by Tulsidas are not exact equivalents, but their impact on the society is even greater than Sanskrit Ramayana, because how many people can read Sanskrit Ramayana? While when Ramayana enters the language of people through these rewritings and refractions, it becomes a very powerful cultural force. So what is the role played by translation in literary and cultural history? What does the dominant ideological outlook of the society, how does this affect translation activity? Why did Gandhi select unto this last? He is given by his own ideology and historical positioning. Here is a man who is trying to develop a philosophical framework for anti-colonial resistance. And for him, it's not merely anti-colonial. Freedom struggle for Gandhi is not merely anti-British. It is anti-Western capitalism. So you can see he's developing a large theoretical frame, philosophical frame. And in that philosophical frame, books like Unto This Last played a very important role. We also are interested in how does translation affect ideological currents of the society. And very famous example would be the Orientalist translation of Sanskrit works. And very often Orientalist translations would represent India and the East in a very stereotypical, ahistorical way. And in some ways, that Edward Said has famously argued that this kind of translations were governed by colonial project. So it justified colonialism in many ways. So you can see that you cannot consider translation outside its ideology and politics. You cannot think of translation as an isolated activity that happens only in your libraries or in your reading rooms. Contemporary translation studies often focuses on the function, and it becomes functionalist very often. Like, what is the function of Bible translation in a particular culture? We ask the question about role of translation in the target language and target culture, and the role of target language and culture in the process of translation. It often tends to be descriptive in its approach. So you can see that translation studies has evolved out of the conventional thinking about translation into larger cultural frame. into looking at translation from a larger historical cultural perspective rather than merely as a verbal activity or as a practice. And some of the important contemporary approaches to translation are the descriptive translation studies developed by Gideon Terry, rewriting or manipulation school associated with André Lefebvre and Theo Hermans, and a polysysteme approach developed with Itamar Evans-Zohar. So these are more recent, more influential theorizations of translation. Many contemporary approaches like post-colonial approach and cultural studies approach to translation see translation as an ideological activity involving politics of representation, which can only be understood in its social, cultural, historical context. It also seeks to critically rethink the histories of culture by highlighting the asymmetrical relation between language and culture. There is also the rejection of the idea that translation is a secondary or inferior to original, and the assumption that translation can be understood only in its cultural historical context are central to contemporary translation studies. I would also like to draw your attention to descriptive translation studies, a very powerful framework developed by Gideon Terry. And what he emphasizes is that translation should be defined and read and understood from the perspective of receiving culture only. And he goes on to define translation as anything that culture calls translation. So there is no objective definition of translation, but cultural definition of translation. Something that a culture defines as translation. And that would include for Terry things like pseudo-translation. Pseudo-translation would mean the book, the SL text does not exist. It's merely fabrication. It's merely an invention. So if somebody, say for example, says that these are the poems by Scandinavian poet translated into Tamil. Now you are not going to read it in Scandinavian original. But those poems are actually written by the translator himself or herself. Such kind of translations are called pseudo-translations. And pseudo-translations for Gideon Terry have an equivalent place as so-called real translations. Manipulation and rewriting school of translation studies is associated with André Lefebvre and Theo Hermans, where they emphasize the role of translation, the function of translation in promoting authors' fame. What role does translation play in making the author famous? And I am reminded of very famous translations of Sarat Chandra Chatterjee in Gujarati and Marathi. And people used to think that Sarat Chandra's works like Shrikant or like Devdas or like Parinita are Gujarati or Marathi novels when they were actually translations. But they were so popular. And Sarat Chandra became one of the most famous authors in translation. Along with, say, for example, Rabindranath Tagore. So there would not be any literary history in India which would not talk of Tagore or Sarat Chandra, because Sarat Chandra and Tagore exist in Gujarati, in Marathi, in Bengali, I'm sure in Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam as well. So translations play a role in manipulation or establishing the fame of author. That is something that Lefebvre and Hermans are trying to emphasize. The polysysteme theory of Itamar Evans-Zohar is a very sharply argued position where it sees translation as intervention into polysysteme. So translation is not merely a verbal act, but it's a kind of intervention, and it adds to the dynamism of a cultural polysysteme or cultural system. So it has a very powerful role to play in his approach. Itamar Evans-Zohar is associated with Tel Aviv School of Translation Studies. And many of you may be familiar with post-colonial approaches, of course. And we are actually looking at these two books from post-colonial perspective. We are looking at these two texts from post-colonial cultural studies angle. The relationship between literature and translation, literary studies and translation studies in the Western society was a very problematic one, because translation was seen as very marginal activities. And scholars like André Lefebvre have argued that this is largely because of romantic notions of originality and genius. Of the writer, and also due to Platonic and Christian view of translation as inferior and derivative, 4 times removed from reality. Remember what Plato had famously said about art, that it's 3 times removed from reality. Translation is 4 times removed from reality, and therefore, in Platonic scheme of things, translation would be highly inauthentic. Art itself is inauthentic. Translation would be even more inauthentic than art. In Christian scheme of things, as we discussed the curse of Babel, and the translation is seen as a kind of post-lapsarian or post-fall phenomena, where multiplicity of languages is seen as a problem, is seen as negative thing instead of seeing as positive, because you cannot promote the word of God without translation, and proselytization requires translation, and without translation you cannot spread God's word. So multiplicity of languages were seen as barriers or negative things. At the same time, Christian view of translation is also, it puts the original on pedestal. It's considered as sacred text which should not be defiled, which should not be contaminated. And you can see how these romantic ideas of originality and genius, so poets and the writers are genius while translators are laborers. These kind of beliefs are deeply ingrained into Western thinking about translation. If you come to India and if you look at pre-colonial views of translation, there was no word like translation. There was a word like anuvad, which is not same as translation at all. Anuvad would more of a kind of repetition or reiteration of something. If you look at translation and original, binary did not exist in India, which is something that we should think about. So Kamban's translation of Ramayana or Tulsidas' rewriting of Ramayana are not seen as inferior activities, but they are seen as equally important or even more important activities. So this actually flies in the face of Eurocentric and nationalist view of translation that we are used to. Romantic notion of originality and genius, the Platonic and Christian view of translation are deeply, I think they deeply influence Western thinking of translation till 20th century, when people like Walter Benjamin, Jacques Derrida, and many others tried to move out of this very Eurocentric thinking about translation. And therefore, relation between translation studies and literary studies, if it is to be made more productive, Lefebvre proposes that there are 3 distinctions that any researcher should make before researching translations. And what are those 3 distinctions? Lefebvre's first distinction is between translating and translation. So whether the researcher is studying translations as books, as products, as texts, or is translation being studied as an activity, needs to be first distinguished. So if you are taking up a research project, maybe MPhil or PhD, or you are writing a research paper on translation, then you have to first clarify which is your stand, what stand you are taking. Are you looking at translation as a product, or you're looking at translation as a process? The second distinction that you have to make is between normative and evaluative approach to translation, or taking translation, or taking a descriptive approach to translation. Which means if you are looking at Gandhi's translation of Ruskin, or Kunte's translation of Savarkar, are you going to evaluate those translations? Are you going to judge which is better? Or are you going to take a descriptive approach where you're just talking about the strategies and try to examine those strategies descriptively? That's the second distinction. And third distinction is between analysis of translation and production of translation. And this is where very often Indian scholars make a mess. People have not yet grown used to the idea that translation can be studied as a product. We have not yet actually adapted to this idea. And strangely, and this is my view, that if you look at translation as a creative activity, then we don't teach in colleges how to write poems or how to write novels, but we teach students how to study novels or how to study poems. But when it comes to translation, we are so much obsessed with how to translate that we forget that you need not ask that question. All the research in translation is not about getting better at translation yourself. You can study translation as an object, somebody else's translations. You can study Gandhi's translation. You can study Savarkar's translation. You can study all these translations without you being a translator. So this distinction for me, these three distinctions have to be made before you embark on a research project in translation. And this is how Lefebvre argues that the traditional, this is how you can formulate your own research methodology. So these three methodological distinctions for Lefebvre are key for having a fruitful and productive dialogue between literary studies and translation studies. And looking at these three distinctions, if you look at the traditional study of translation, it is largely process and practice centric. It is also evaluative, and contemporary approach to translation is more product centric and descriptive. Very famously, Lefebvre has gone on to define translation and rethink what we mean by translation. So he goes on to argue, let us accept that refractions, and refraction is the term that he has made popular. That is the adaptation of work of literature to different audience with the intention of influencing the way in which audience reads the work has been with us in literature throughout the history. There is huge history of refraction. Refractions are integral part of our culture. Imagine, remember that how many of us have actually read Mahabharata, the Sanskrit Mahabharata, but all of us know the story of Mahabharata because we know it through refraction, through our grandmothers, through our parents, through our elders, teachers telling you the stories, to the TV series, to the comic books, and so on and so forth. These activities like comic books or commentaries or research papers or the oral retellings, like our grandmother told us the stories of Mahabharata, or our parents did that. These are forms of refractions, and refractions, according to Lefebvre, are integral to culture. So according to him, translation should be seen as refraction. Then we understand the power of the text, the refraction text. And he says refractions are to be found in obvious form of translation, but less obvious form of criticism, commentary, historiography, plot summary. And I am reminded of my college days when some of the students used to read guides of Shakespeare without reading the Shakespeare's text. And that is refraction. So refractions have been part of history and they influence our culture. And he goes on to argue that they are extremely influential. I will quickly come to comparative literature and world literature. World literature, the idea of world literature is very old, going back to Goethe and Marx. Goethe, in his letter to one of his younger contemporaries about idea of world literature is coming, is very famous. And Marx's idea of world literature as a kind of product of global capitalism. These are important theories of world literature, but these are 19th century. So the traditional meaning of world literature, just like we made a distinction between traditional view of translation, we are now looking at traditional view of world literature. The traditional view of world literature it's either quantitative, like all literatures in all languages of the world, or it meant qualitative and canonical idea, like masterpieces of world literature, Shakespeare, Dante, Vyas. These are the masterpieces of world literature. So that is another way of looking. But people like David Damrosch have redefined world literature in 1990s onwards, and he sees world literature to mean all literary works that circulate beyond the culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. A work only has an effective life as world literature whenever it is actively present within literary system beyond that of its original culture. For example, a very famous the Tamil epic, I think, Seal Pattikaram, I don't know if I got the pronunciation right, was used as a metaphor and myth by Arun Kolatkar in his very famous Marathi poems, where he talks about the Kannagi story and Kovlan's story in a very unique way in Marathi. So thus, Seal Pattikaram becomes world literature. World literature is those texts which exist in refraction in another language like Marathi, say for example. Or you may, the translation from A.K. Ramanujan's translation of the South Indian classics like Kannad Vachankar or even Tamil Alvars is very famous because the text moves out of its culture of origin and starts circulating beyond the confines of those culture. So according to Damrosch, world literature is not an infinite, ungraspable canon of works, but rather a mode of circulation and of reading, a mode that is applicable to individual works as to the bodies of material, available for reading the established classics and new discoveries alike. You can think of certain forms like short story or the novel. Modern short story and modern novel are not Indian products. We had storytelling traditions which were very different. They were performative, oral, but the idea of modern short story as you find it in, say, for example, Anton Chekhov, where there is no story. Story is that there is no story. So the modern definitions of short story or novels or even literary essays or travel writing, all these forms are not Indian, indigenous, but they are world literary forms because they circulate outside their origin. In fact, sonnet is not English form. And when we talk of Shakespearean sonnet and Petrarchan sonnet, we are talking about how Italian form is being indigenized, nativized by Shakespeare. So forms can also be considered as world literature. There is one Dionysius Durizin who has talked about interliterary model of world literature, something that I don't want to go into detail just now, probably because I think we don't have sufficient time on our hands. Do we have enough time? I think I have 10 minutes.
Yeah? Sir, you can take your time, sir. You have 15 minutes more, sir, or else you can take your time.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So Dionysius Durizin is one of the Slovak scholars who has come up with interliterary models of world literature, and he defines interliterary processes as against the idea of influence studies, which is a very important idea in comparative literature. Durizin uses interliterary processes as objects of literary research, and the analogy that I give to explain this idea very often is, say for example, you are preparing tea, then it's a process of making tea. So what I do is I take ingredients like sugar and tea leaves and milk and water and then prepare tea. So in making of this product, there are multiple ingredients which come from all over the world. So you cannot really say that sugar has influenced tea or milk influences tea. So the idea of influence is replaced by interliterary processes, the processes which are not limited to particular nation or particular language. So in order to write Gujarati ghazal, say for example, then the form of ghazal comes from the Persian Arabic traditions. It goes into Urdu and Hindustani, and it goes then from Hindustani and Urdu into Gujarati. And Gujarati poets very often use Sanskrit meters to write ghazals in Gujarati. So what is happening is that the form is not influenced by somebody, but it's a process in which there are multiple ingredients taken from multiple places. So why do we need this kind of idea? It's because we are obsessed with the ideas of influence. And what happens in influence very often is that we consider the influencer to be superior, culturally superior to the influence, the recipient culture. So in order to overcome this kind of hierarchic binary, Durizin has proposed this interliterary process, the idea of interliterary process, and then he goes on to talk about interliterary idea of world literature, where world literature is not an object, but a kind of a dynamic construct which changes with time. Another modern contemporary notion of world literature comes from digital humanities, and that idea is of distant reading. Franco Moretti, a very famous theorist, has argued that literature around us is now unmistakably a planetary system, that it is one and unequal, with a core and periphery. The question, Moretti argues, is not what we should do. The question is how. The question is how should we study it? What do we mean by core and periphery? For example, we know so many English authors, but how many English people know Tamil authors? For example, how many students in London would know about contemporary Tamil writers, for example, which we don't know. That is what Moretti means by one and unequal. That means we are at the peripheries of a world system. So Moretti argues that we should now develop different methods for studying world literature, which is a planetary, unequal system made of core and periphery. And he believes that in order to read the system that is planetary and the archive that is almost infinite, close reading is not going to help, because close reading would involve a very small sample size and data set. For example, if you're talking about, and that's what we do in our colleges typically, after reading 3 plays by Shakespeare, we start commenting on Elizabethan cultural history, when there were thousands of books written at the time of Shakespeare. But we select only 3 and then draw conclusions. So close reading very often relies on a very small sample size, and that's a methodological problem according to Moretti. And therefore, he goes on to talk about something called distant reading, where thousands of books that are written are digitized, and you develop computing technology to read this massive big data of text. And he calls this method as distant reading. Now, I'm not going to discuss this distant reading right now at length, because my focus is more on translation studies. But I'm just pointing out the recent development in translation studies, because it's my argument that the recent development in translation studies have almost laid the foundation to the modern notion of world literature. That's my argument. Damrosch gives 3-fold definition of world literature. The first is world literature is an elliptical refraction of national literature. What do you mean by elliptical refraction? For example, a performance of Mahabharata by Peter Brooks in London is an elliptical refraction of Indian text in Western society. So that is what world literature means. Second definition is world literature is writing that gains in translation. And that's a very powerful definition of world literature. Sarvodaya is not, when we compare Sarvodaya with Unto This Last, our question should not be what is lost in translation, but what is gained in translation. And what we have gained is nothing less than the great political ideology for freedom struggle, nothing less than that. World literature is not a set of texts, but a mode of reading, a form of detached arguments. Now, if you see, then these definitions of world literature, you can see that all of these definitions are deeply connected to the notion of translation. More recently, Damrosch has compared two perspectives on world literature. One, as world literature as a vast landscape and expansion of planetary system, or you study world literature within national context. That means you study how Shakespeare is received in Tamil. What is the role played by Shakespeare in development of modern Tamil theatre? These are the questions that we ask in world literature, and world literature is not like an infinite outside, but something that is within our national traditions. These are some of the important contemporary formulations of world literature, and my argument is that all of these, and coming to the end of my presentation, all of these are based on the definition of translation. And this definition of translation is the expanded definition of translation, not a very restrictive way of looking at translation as a verbal equivalent, search for verbal equivalent. It's not that restrictive notion of translation, but an expanded notion of translation. And I'm sure you must have heard of the famous tripartite division given by Jakobson of translation as interliterary, intraliterary, and intersemiotic, where intersemiotic translation is nothing less than moving away from the one media into another. So such broad definition of translations have helped or are being at the heart of the notion of world literature. And that is why recent critics of world literature, like Emily Apter, has taken, has focused on translation in her attack on the whole idea of world literature. So Emily Apter, in her very famous book called Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, offers a critique of various models of world literature by arguing that these notions rely on translatability assumption and consequently incommensurability, and untranslatable are insufficiently built into the literary heuristic. What she means is that there are so many things which are untranslatable, but they are not taken on board while we theorize world literature. That is her complaint. She questions the tendencies in world literature towards reflective endorsement of cultural equivalence and substitutability, as well as celebration of nationalistic and ethnically branded differences. So world literature and translation studies work with the assumption that translation is a good thing as a critical practice, enabling communication across languages, and the right to untranslatable, according to Apter, was blindsided. So you can see that one of the most serious critiques of the idea of world literature has focused on the question of the underlying assumption of translatability. Because unless you accept that possibility of translation, you cannot think of world literature. So world literature, the idea of world literature, and that's the argument that I have made, is based on the translatability assumptions. Of course, I don't agree with Apter, because problem is that once you start looking at untranslatable, then you are not able to speak of it in any way. And it ends up being something like Sapir-Whorf thesis, the very famous Sapir-Whorf argument, which Roman Jakobson is critiquing in his very famous essay that I'm sure you must have discussed, the tripartite division of translation, where he talks about translation in semiotic sense rather than in verbal sense. And he goes on to argue that everything is possible in translation except literature. You can translate everything except literature. So Jakobson's very famous critique of Sapir-Whorf thesis is something that Emily Apter should look at very seriously, because I think that is where it creates problem. And David Damrosch has pointed out that Apter says she's against world literature, but she doesn't say what is she for. So it's easy to say that I'm against ABC, but it's very difficult to posit yourself that I am for FGH. So these are my views on translation. And to sum up whatever I have been saying is that the conventional thinking about translation is inadequate and almost irrelevant when we look at some of the most important translations in our first languages. So one of the assignments that I have given you is to look at which are two most important translations in your first language or in your mother tongue, and try to figure out why are they so important. So once we start asking ourselves, why are these two translations so important? Say, for example, Bible in Tamil. Say, for example, Ghalib in Tamil, or whatever, or Ambedkar in Tamil. You ask yourself, why are these translations so important? Then the questions of whether they are good translations or bad translations, or whether their spirit comes through, or whether it is literal or faithful, are irrelevant questions. We are interested in the cultural, historical context in which those translations came up. And what we also ask more interesting questions of the politics of translation and the influence of this translation. Incidentally, I have heard that Savarkar's book that I just mentioned, one of the book that he translated from English into Marathi was a book called Autobiography of Giuseppe Mazzini. And Mazzini was a very famous Italian Italian nationalist. And this book was banned by British government. And that's why people memorize, Maharashtrians memorize the preface of that book. And when British discovered that, and they also made it a point that anybody arrested with that book, and this is I have heard, I don't know for sure, that that person's tongue will be cut off. That was the punishment given if you are found with translation. So I'm sure translation has got great cultural significance, and the conventional views of translation won't help us to uncover these important cultural significances. So this is where I want to stop, and I want to thank Dr. Maithili for having me on this very important translation workshop, and having me share my views, my research on translation. So I would like to express my gratitude also to all the listeners who have so patiently been listening to my conversation. So thank you, Dr. Maithili. Hope I am on time.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Shall we take one or two questions in the discussion session?
Yeah, please do. Please do, please.
Participants, if you have any questions, kindly put it in the chat box and it will be addressed. Participants, we can thank each other later, and I would like you to make use of such a versatile personality to clear our doubts regarding translation and get a spark from him.
Yeah, there is a very interesting question by T. Ajit Kumar asking, what is your comment on poor translation? Right, and I think this is a very interesting question. Now, how do you discover that a particular translation is good and one or bad? One way of discovering is you know the original language. You discover that this poem is badly translated from Tamil because you know Tamil. However, most of the translations are not meant for people who know the first language. So judgments very often come from those bilinguals for whom those text is not meant. Besides, what is good, what is bad becomes irrelevant as in the questions like Sarvodaya, for example, the text that I am discussing. Does this question help us to understand the cultural significance of translation? Is my counter question. Now, Sarvodaya may be a bad translation, and in my view, it's profoundly transformative translation that Gandhi has done. Sarvodaya is a term that you find in Sanskrit. He has coined from Sanskrit, and it is deeply imbibed in Indian metaphysical traditions, the idea of Sarvodaya. while unto this last comes from deeply from Christian metaphysical theological frameworks. So is it a good translation or bad translation? The whole question of judging a translation is a very problematic inquiry, and very often it makes us ask irrelevant questions. Is the translation of Savarkar's text good or bad becomes needless. What we know is that Rash Bihari Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose published the English translation of those books. So for me, these questions are not very important to understand or unpack the cultural significance of translation or the ideological impact of the translation. So I hope I'm able to put forth I have responded. If we get trapped in good, bad trap, then we enter into very subjective domain. I may like that particular film and you may not like that particular film. So that film is good for me and that film is not good for me. So judging is not always very interesting way to unpack the cultural and historical significance of literary texts or translations. That's my view. Okay. There is, I think, a question about pseudo translation from Raj Lakshmi. Pseudo translations, as I have said, is important part of Gideon Terry's descriptive translation studies, where he says that translations are defined by receiving cultures. So say, for example, I always keep forgetting the name of a British poet who became very famous by saying that these are Scottish ballads. But they were not Scottish ballads, they were his own words. So these are pseudo translations where the source text does not exist are called pseudo translation. Now you may dismiss them as useless, but for Gideon Terry and descriptive translation studies, these are as important as other translations. So I request you to look up Gideon Terry's books, that is towards descriptive translation studies. Okay. What are the other questions? I think Dr. Veena Singh talks about politics of translation. Then my entire lecture is about politics of translation. Translation is always political. And when we say always political, I don't define politics in terms of party politics, like BJP versus Congress. I'm not looking at politics. I am talking about politics in political science view of politics. Politics as involving conflicts and attempt to resolve conflicts. That is how political science defines politics. So if you expand or if you take more scientific understanding of the term politics, then you can understand how translation is political at all times, right? So we are looking at politics from a very expanded and more conceptual definition of political rather than merely talking about politics as party politics. I'm not talking about AIDMK versus DMK. I'm talking about politics as what are the ideological moves that translation is making, how it's trying to influence a culture, what are the things that it's not saying, and so on and so forth. There is a question by Kamala Devi where she talks about translation does multilateral diplomacy in the field of cultural and the political. Well, diplomacy is part of politics, international politics. So you can say that translation does play a role in part of diplomacy. For example, if two countries want to improve their relations, say for example, we are talking of post-corona COVID situation, and you want to improve your relation with China, then one thing that you can think of is to translate more literature from Chinese into our own first languages. And we can also expect Chinese to translate more from our literature. So translation does play, diplomacy does play an important, diplomacy can become an important aspect of translation. There is another question here from Sabyasachi, who says that, do you think the refraction in one language part of WL, how are they valued in literature? Well, in our literary studies, we don't take refractions very seriously. For example, how many of us consider comic books based on Ramayana as serious literature? But our understanding of Ramayana has come from TV series and comic books. So these multiple rewritings or retellings of the text are very important part of our culture. And as student of literature, we should be engaging with them on very serious, very seriously. For example, many of us have watched Harry Potter rather than read it. There is one question. Translation of comics like Tintin by SB says, this question by SB says, translation of comics, Tintin or Asterix into how to translate Belgium or Gaelic influences. Now, how to translate question comes from where, why should you translate? What is your intention behind translating? What is the scopus, as they say, behind translating will influence how to translate. So if your translation wants to bring out cultural histories and differences, then you will translate more of Belgian and Gaelic influences through paratext, like footnotes, like glossary, like prefaces and suffixes. Or you may try to incorporate certain terms from Belgian culture through circumlocutions, right? So these are certain strategies that you would develop if at all you want to retain cultural differences. But if you don't want to do it, then you can bring in a lot of creative elements from your own culture. So how you translate depends on why you are translating. So your intention and scopus of translation decides its strategy. There is a question from Anshuman Pradhan. Can folk literature of world literature, one language, achieve the tag of world literature if it gets famous? Definitely. Definitely. Think of Panchatantra and stories from Panchatantra going into Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. Or look at Aesop's fables, and you'll find a lot of things which have come from Indian folk tales. So folk tales have a way of traveling, and that is what Damrosch says, that world literature is a mode of circulation. So if folk literature travels outside its cultural frames or boundaries, it becomes world literature. Okay, what is the advice to new translators to overcome difficulties in translation? That's, I think, one question. Where is it? Before that, I think S. Eunice Catherine has said, the translation is like woman. If she is beautiful, she is not faithful, or if she wants to take my opinion, and my opinion is what I have given. This is a very conventional way of understanding translation. Not just that, it's also sexist, right? It's of no use to me to point out that Gandhi's translation is not faithful to Ruskin. So it's not beautiful or whatever. This kind of questions for me are irrelevant in analysis of, or if you're trying to unpack and uncover cultural significance of translation. Right, that's my view. So I'm just reiterating my view here. There is Srikant Ramesh Chandra who says that, can you shed light on translation with reference to Marquez and his imaginary and translation of Narayan Malgudi days growing as village as world changes? I didn't get the question. I didn't get the question. I am, of course, familiar with both the texts, but I don't get the question that you're asking. Anyway, Gayatri M asked me, in your presentation, you have mentioned that translation is influenced by dominant ideologies. Yeah, dominant ideologies of translating cultures, receiving culture. That's what I meant. So when Gandhi is translating unto this last, he is influenced by the politics of the period. and that is nationalist politics of the period. So that is how it affects this choice of the text. So even choice of the text is never neutral. It's always driven by certain ideological and cultural projects. Translation becomes popular than original. I feel okay. Sir, could you relate literature and translation? How are they related? Well, how are they related? I don't, in terms of literary and translation, I don't create a binary between creative and original and translation. Bible that you read is what? Original or translation? It's literature. Ramayana that you read in Tamil is what? Original or translation? It is both. So I don't make a kind of rigorous, watertight compartmentalization between translation and literature, because all original has an impact of some other text. At the same time, all translation involve creativity. There is one question which says, is there impact of psychology behind translation? What do you think of feminism in translation? Psychology involves human mind, the whole theory of behavior. So if you look at translation process, then a lot of it happens within translator's mind, which is thought to be as a kind of black box. You cannot open it and see what's going on in translator's mind to analyze the process of translation. Though many people have tried to define it, you see that there is some domain which is a gray area where we cannot make out what is happening in the process of translation. And Roman Jakobson probably very famously said that translation is one of the most mysterious things in the history of the world. I don't quote him literally, but coming to feminism and translation, thank you for this question. Feminists have engaged with the question of translation very seriously. And one of the earliest statements are by people like Gayatri Spivak, also by Laurie Chamberlain. And Laurie Chamberlain has very famously argued, and this is what brings us to the earlier question about translation and women, beautiful and faithful thing. So they have interrogated these kind of metaphors, and they have tried to figure out, why do people think of translation in this sexist ways? Why is translation so gendered? And Laurie Chamberlain looks at the entire history of translation theory, where thinking about original and translation, translator and the writer have been in gendered terms. So I request you to look up Laurie Chamberlain and Sherry Stauning and Gayatri Spivak, who have theorized translation from a feminist perspective. Reshma Jogi says, if translation creates a negative ideology or impact on society, what would you call it, good and bad? Again, the question of good and bad, I think, are not very interesting questions, personally. Think of Mein Kampf, very famous autobiography by Hitler. Do you think it's beneficial to society? Frankly. But I'm not interested in whether that is good or bad. I'm interested in the ideological moves, the impact that such books have on our society. So instead of asking whether it's good or bad, it's more interesting to ask whether these translations, how have these translations impacted society? So I prefer not to judge translations. I am more interested to uncover their cultural significance, because judging translation is usually a waste of time as a translator. I feel that my poem is the best, but then somebody may come up with another better poem. So my view on this judgment business is that if you think you can translate it better than me, do it yourself. So I have translated a lot, and if people feel that I have not done a good job, I tell them that you do it yourself. That's the only response I give to this whole judging business. But as a researcher and student of translation, my question is, How do you unpack its cultural significance? That is more interesting than judging.
Sir. Sir, it's so kind of you to take up too many questions and just enlarge our vision on translation, sir. So we come to the end of the discussion session. And
Before we come to the end, I think those people whose questions I have not addressed can
Yes, sir.
email me their questions. I think
Yes,
then I will
sir.
respond, because I don't want to leave them unaddressed. So
Sure,
you can
sir.
email me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for your kind gesture, sir. And your presentation was such a mind-blowing one, sir. You took us a trip from old literature through comparative literature and landed us in the world literature. You have taken up examples from the translation world and explained the process of translation, which was highly motivating to us. And your presentation vividly explains your vast exposure to the literary field and translation. And you have opened up new avenues like digital humanities, distant reading, elliptical refraction, etc., sir. And you have paved way for us with strategies to approach world literature and combine it with translation. All of us were really spellbound, sir. Thank you so much for being with us today and helping us to enrich our knowledge on translation, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
So it's my pleasure, and I want to thank all of you for having me, listening to me, and Dr. Maithili in particular for having me abroad in this very fascinating workshop that you have organized. So I wish all the best to all of you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Participants, we just move on to our just next 5 minute session to open up with your feedback regarding the workshop. We can take up 2 to 3 participants expressing your views regarding the workshop. So I request the participants to unmute yourself and give us your feedback about the session, and then I'll continue to the instructions.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am, Shanti, ma'am.
Hello. I'm Dr.
Yes, ma'am.
Shanti from Goa.
Yeah. Ma'am, please continue,
Can
ma'am.
you hear
You're
me?
audible. Yeah, you're audible, ma'am.
Yes. It was very interesting and informative session. It's not translation, but I do on Commonwealth literature and comparative studies and American literature. But this was an eye opener for me, because I I might have read the translation works, but after attending this workshop, I am going to do my research, at least 1 or 2 papers I would like to publish, and the credit goes entirely to this workshop and to you, ma'am Maithili, because you have done an excellent job, and the resource persons whom you have selected were very nice, and hats off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your encouraging words.
Shall I?
We can have, yes, sir.
Shall I? I'm Sri Prasad. Thank you, ma'am, for
Yes.
giving me a chance like this. I think this was really awesome. For the past 7 days, we have been having teachers from very difficult or different perspectives. Translation has become a necessity of this time, because in this particular juncture where we are facing very much problems, we are all becoming an island in ourselves. Translation shows us that this is the right time. This is the right time to come together. As John Donne rightly says, no man is an island. No text is an island in itself. It is also a part of the continent. I congratulate Maithili ma'am for organizing such a wonderful, sessions for the past 7 days. And the resource persons you have selected, I should make my point that they are all diverse, and they have making us or taking us from journey to adventure to inspiration and to various arise of translation. I hope all the participants in this particular program have been benefited by this. Extend my sincere gratitude to the organizers. And sometimes you were showing your managerial skills as the lieutenant, and that is also fine. I really cherish to be a part of this seminar. Thank you very much for the same.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable comment.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Hello, good morning, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah,
Ma'am,
you're audible. You can proceed.
Yeah, I would like to congratulate you, ma'am, for having arranged this wonderful webinar. It was very interesting, very fruitful, and all the sessions were very, very, very good. And in fact, I'm handling a translation paper for the PG students. When I went through this webinar only, I came to understand how this can be taught in a very effective manner. And all the sessions were very, very interesting, and it gave an eye opener for every one of us. And the theories, which were very, very difficult to handle in the class, was very simplified by the resource person. Hats off you, hats off to you, ma'am, for giving a wonderful opportunity to have such resource persons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I could feel Vincent Soundran sir is still in the meeting. He's a versatile personality and a translator from Madurai. I am an ardent fan of him, sir. We hear a word from you. And any other participants to give feedback?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, madam.
Proceed.
Hello. Madam, can I talk to?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yeah.
Madam, I'm Dr. Said Ali Badusha.
Yes, sir.
I sincerely thank the organizers, ma'am. Very rarely we get lectures, webinars on translation studies and on the practical aspects of translation. Thank you so much for organizing such a 7-day international web workshop. We all enjoyed it. Really, we got a lot of insights. It was very, very useful, particularly the writer, translator. And today's session was very, very useful. We got a lot of insights, and it was an all-inclusive session today. So we sincerely, on behalf of all the participants, I sincerely thank the organizers. Thank you so much, friends. Looking forward to a program like this in the near future. Thank you.
Sure, sir. Participants, thank you all for your valuable suggestions. Yes, Ruby, ma'am.
Ma'am, actually, I have been translating a lot of short stories and other things.
Yes,
But this one, today, the sir's session, I got an idea of translating, pseudo translation. So I used to write some poems. I can translate my own poems into English or in other languages. So some useful ideas I got from this. For the past 15 years, I have been in this field of translation. Then
Yes,
I
ma'am.
thought only theories can be very much useful for translation. But now I have got an idea that even by practice we can improve more, and we can get more ideas, and we can implement more solution to the translation.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Yes,
so much
ma'am.
of thanks, ma'am, for giving such an opportunity to attend this workshop. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Participants, we close the feedback session from the participant side. Thank you all for your encouraging words. And now it's time for me from the convener's desk to give a note of thanks to all the good hearts who have made this possible. Starting from my family, Vasavi, throughout the journey, the encouraging words from my principal, Dr. Anjay Kumar, Secretary Mr. S. Dayanand, President N. Sudhakar, former secretaries Mr. V. Adikeshavan and Mrs. Hemavati Sadasivam, and Director Professor V. Sivakumar. They channelized me throughout the journey. Words are containers of power. Use them to support and inspire, as saying goes. And this is what the above mentioned personalities have done it for me. My gratitude are due to my well-wishers, former principal, Dr. N. Jaishankar sir, who guided me with his comments on daily basis after the session and charging me with his positivity, and also former principal and head of the English department, Mr. E. Agilan sir, for guiding me on language aspects. And it would be incomplete if I don't thank my Wasavians teaching staff members, in particular my friends who motivated me through their encouraging words and messages. Though apart by distance due to COVID-19, they've made me felt close to heart with their encouraging words. I would also like to thank my college non-teaching staff members, Office Superintendent Ms. Namagiri ma'am and typist Mrs. Bhuvaneshwari for their support in making ready the official communications to send to the speakers. I truly feel that words wouldn't be sufficient to thank all the keynote speakers starting from day 1 to day 7 for devoting their time to educate the participants on translation platform. Yes, my dear participant, the greatest gift you can ever give to others is your time, because you can never regain it in your lifetime. And they have done it for us. Everyone were unique on their aspects of translation and delivered knowledge-packed session. I thank Dr. Mahendra Manyam from Malaysia, Dr. R. Dharani from Tirupur, Dr. Shanti Chitra from Chennai, Dr. S. Uma Shankar from Sri Lanka, Dr. M. A. Sushila from Madurai, Dr. Sachin C. Ketkar from Gujarat, for readily accepting my invitation to be the keynote speaker and who were the reason behind the successful completion of this workshop. I'm not sharing this as a formality note, my dear participant. It is that just I want to underline. A journey of 1,000 miles begin with a single step. Once you decide to do something, come out of the fear and start executing. Your one step will lead you with ways to find all the other avenues, as I have reached here to this destination of hosting the International Web Workshop. I'm not well versed in technology, but I took the help of my well-wisher, and even to reach out the speakers outside India, I got the help of my friends from Coimbatore, and I was put up to the next step automatically. So always remember, if it was easy, then everyone will be doing it. So never be in fear of doing something which is not easy. Come out of your comfort zone, take your turn to prove yourself. Of course, difficulties will arise, like the technological constraints that we encountered now and then. And even, a participant has sent me a message that he will file a case against me as I denied him from entering the Google Classroom. And sometimes you feel people around you do not support you, and your domestic atmosphere sometimes turns out to be obstacle. But we have to overcome everything. Give us a push and come out of this comfort zone and create histories. But remember, Henry David Thoreau says, success usually comes to those who are too busy to be looking for it. So let us get connected with this literature platform. And I hope this workshop has just thrown a stone in your thinking, and it will create the ripples. We will just get connected through the ripples that has created within us, and let us all be bring ourselves out as a translator or a researcher in translation arena. So Martin Luther King even says, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't walk, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. And I'm surely failing in my duty if I don't recognize the kind of cooperation that I receive from the participants. Every resource person gave me a comment that they have attended 2 or 3 webinars earlier, and this was the one where the participants behaved in a well-mannered way. Though I was labeled as I was a little bit harsh with my words when I was passing initial instructions to the participants through WhatsApp group, but still the control that we had in that group made us this platform as a learner platform. So thank you all the participants for your extreme cooperation to bring about this workshop successfully in a grand way. And some of our participants even called me and asked to guide how to make a Google Meet and host a webinar. And they conveyed me that they got an inspiration from this platform, which I feel it gives a high order of self-satisfaction to me. And this is the first step, my dear participants. Let's go ahead and achieve success. As a convener, I would like to just register the statistical data regarding this international web workshop. The total registrations that I received were 704 from 4 different countries outside India, and from 18 countries, 18 states in India. And the number of participants from other country were 10, and participants from other states of India were 152, and Tamil Nadu registration participants were 558. I'm happy to share that throughout the 7-day sessions, we were able to cater to the need of 250 participants online effectively and 325 participants offline through YouTube links. Our Google Meet platform is consequently filled with complete strength of 250 participants throughout the journey of 7 days. It gives me immense pleasure in hosting this workshop, and I thank each and everyone who helped in a little way or the other to bring out this workshop in a successful way. So I just want to end up with the lines of Robert Frost from The Road Not Taken. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Right? So I hope we had given you a very good platform to make yourself exposure to the translation field. And I also want to quote the lines of Bharati. தேடிச் சோறு தினம் தின்று பல சின்னஞ்சிறு கதைகள் பேசி மனம் வாடி துன்பம் மிக உழன்று பிறர் வாடப்பல செயல்கள் செய்து நரை கூடிக்கில பருவமெய்தி கொடுங்கூற்றுக்கு இறையென பின் மாயும் பல வேடிக்கை மனிதரைப் போல் நான் வீழ்வேன் என்று நினைத்தாயோ? Yes, my dear participants, we are so special. We are so unique. Each one of us are just embedded with too much of unique qualities. Let us focus on that and get success and be happy throughout our life. Thank you for giving me a golden opportunity to address you. Thank you all. Right, participants, I have a little instructions to be given to you regarding your certificates. Once you submit today's feedback by tomorrow morning 9 o'clock, and then I'm going to circulate collection of particulars from you for the certificate purpose. Once you fill up these 2 forms and submit it, after that we will process the certificate writing process, and then we will send you the certificates through your email. I request you to stay in the WhatsApp group that is created for this purpose, because the further instructions are to be given in that WhatsApp group only, and you will be receiving your certificates by Monday or Tuesday. So if you don't get your certificate by Tuesday night 9 o'clock, and then you can call me up regarding certificates. So this is what from the convener side to tell you to the participants. Thank you all. Thank you very much for staying with us and making this 7 days a sweet memory to carry till the life end. So we can sign off from the meeting. We'll meet you on a different platform again. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.